It looks like a scene out of Sleeping Beauty. A princess sleeps on a raised platform inside a marbled hall. A knight is setting off on an adventure to waken her. This, however, is not the classic fairy tale, but the beginning of Zelda II, The Adventure of Link. The princess, the title character, the first princess of her kingdom to go by that name, and one all others are named for. The green-clad knight is Link, also mentioned in the title. It's our job to guide Link through 7 palaces to claim the Triforce and wake the princess. This week on Legendary Adventures, a Legend of Zelda playthrough podcast, we're heading to the palaces to obtain the Triforce of Courage and awaken the princess. I should note again that I played through the special edition of the game on Nintendo Switch NES Online. This version starts players with all stats maxed out at level 8 and gives players all magic spells. Despite having all the spells, I did not use a spell until I would have acquired it in normal play. I also made sure to find each old man as if I were still acquiring the spells and the sword techniques all the same. So, let's begin. Players start in the North Castle where the princess sleeps. Players exit the castle by traveling either right or left. The game then switches to an overhead view. Unlike the original Legend of Zelda, the manual for Zelda II does not contain a walkthrough directing players on how to reach the first dungeon. It does, however, contain a map on pages 41 and 42. The map clearly marks the first palace inside Parappa Desert to the northeast. It also marks the locations of the towns of Rauru and Ruto. 2 caves are also marked, one to the south of Ruto and one to the northeast of Rauru. With this map, I imagine most players can deduce what to do fairly quickly. They must travel to the first palace in Parappa Desert through the cave north of Rauru. What if the player doesn't have the map though? In contrast to the first game, Zelda II contains some more overt hints on where to go. The road from North Castle leads east, hinting to an initial travel direction. Players who make it to Rauru will find a number of villagers who provide further hints. A woman tells us to return the crystal. A child tells us to get the candle in Parappa Palace. However, this child confusingly adds go west. The palace is to the north. However, inside the palace, we will travel west to get the candle. There's also a woman in town who tells us to find Heart in southern Parappa. There are at least 2 other hints offered, one to find a hammer to break through roadblocks south of town, and another tells us to use fire attacks if all else fails. These last 2 hints are not immediately relevant to this section of the game, however. It's most important to speak to the woman in the purple dress. We can see her exit her home and then quickly catch up to her and speak to her. She urges us to speak with her father and returns home. Following her inside, she explains that each town has a wise man, and tells us to speak to each of them. Her father grants Link the shield spell. When used, Link's tunic turns red and damage is cut in half. We now move on to Parappa Desert. We must travel through a cave to the north, which presents one of the more odd design decisions at this early point in the game. The cave that players must travel through is dark. The candle we collect in Parappa Palace is the item that we need to light the cave. This particular cave is pretty simple, but it does contain one enemy that players will not be able to see easily in the darkness. Players who watch the ground closely will be able to see the enemy move across, but I suspect most first-time players won't see it. I know I didn't the first time I played. This seems to be an example of the designers adding extra difficulty for its own sake. Based on the hint from the townsperson in Rauru, we can head east, then south down the shoreline, to the southernmost point in Parappa to find a heart container inside a small grove of trees. There is a forced trap screen before we get there, and we have to jump over a series of pits while avoiding bubbles that float up from the bottom of the screen. We then do the scene in reverse on the way back. Now to Parappa itself. The palace is fairly straightforward, though we do have to backtrack a number of times to make it to the end. Not far from the entrance, we'll encounter a main mechanic of all the dungeons in the game, an elevator. The elevators in The Adventure of Link do not move without input from the player. We head down. After reaching the lower floor, players who travel to the right will soon meet a dead end in the form of a locked door, sending players back to the left. In this way, Zelda II teaches the player in a similar fashion to Metroid, where players actually need to travel left first in order to progress in the game. In both games, players will run into dead ends if they try to move to the right. In Metroid, players need to find the morphing ball to let them advance. Here, it's a simple key. After we get the key, we continue down the path to the right. We come to another elevator, but if we travel down it, we'll only run into another locked door. We need to continue to a third elevator further to the right and travel up. There are 2 keys to collect along this path. After getting both keys, we backtrack. This portion highlights one of the issues I have with the dungeon design of Zelda II. Items that players need are generally at the end of long passages, that players are then required to backtrack through after getting the item they're after. Later games in the series would cut down on uninteresting backtracking by building loops into the dungeon design, or by using items to recontextualize past rooms in the dungeon. After returning to the elevator, we descend a level and then return to the second elevator. Heading down, then west to the end of a corridor, we find the candle. As will be common in this game, and as was common in the first game as well, this item has no use within the dungeon itself. The candle is used to light up caves elsewhere in the game. Returning to the third elevator, we walk past it to find a room with a fairy to refill our health. Then we descend the third elevator to the lower level. This time we move to the right, using our final key before reaching the boss, Horsehead. This is a large knight who towers over Link, and true to its name, it has the head of the horse. We damage this boss by jumping it and striking the head. The fight itself is pretty straightforward, and I generally have not had trouble with it in the past, even when playing the non-special edition of the game. Players who are not playing the special edition will want to use the shield spell to reduce the damage they take. When Horsehead falls, we receive the final key of the dungeon. Unlike the previous game, bosses do not drop heart containers. Instead, players will be granted enough experience to complete their next level upon placing the crystal in the statue. The statue is found behind a locked door just beyond the boss room. With the crystal placed and the dungeon item collected, we find the palace icon on the map has turned to stone. The dungeon cannot be re-entered. It's a visual indication that players have completely cleared the dungeon. Having completed Madora Palace, we venture back through the now lighted cave, and then head west along the road to the town of Ruto. It's possible to visit this town prior to Madora Palace, but it only becomes necessary to travel here once we have the candle in hand. The townspeople of Ruto offer more hints. Of immediate importance, a woman in a red dress tells us of a missing trophy. It's been taken by the Goria to Tantari Desert. The handy map in the manual shows us that this is the desert area to the north and east of Ruto. It features a cave where our candle will come in handy. We are also told to find a magic container in a cave south of North Castle. First, we head to Tantari Desert. The cave here is not overly difficult with the candle. There are jumps to make and multiple enemies to defeat. We acquire the trophy and then head back the way we came. We then head to a cave south of North Castle. It also poses not much of a challenge with our newly acquired candle. Inside we find a magic container, which is similar to a heart container except this one expands our magic meter. It's also worth noting that on the other side of the mountain range, we can see the next dungeon, Madora Palace, giving us a solid idea of our next destination. Returning to Ruto, we return the trophy to the woman in the red dress. She invites us to her home to meet her father. He teaches us a new spell, Jump, which will greatly increase our jump height. There are more hints offered by the townspeople. One person tells us not to travel to the south unless we have the candle. Luckily we do. Another mentions the Hammer, Spectacle Rock, and Death Mountain. The Hammer we have heard before. Both Spectacle Rock and Death Mountain were locations from the first game. We'll see both return here, and it turns out this hint is essential to the game. We also meet a man who only introduces himself. "I am Error," he says. This has become kind of a meme in certain circles online, and I've seen many commentaries act as though this is just a random bit of nonsense. But it's actually important. We will return to Error later in the game. Now we head south of Ruto. We find a cave there. With the candle, the way forward is plainly visible. There are plenty of enemies to defeat, including Octoroks and Goria. Also notable is a tall ledge. Players cannot reach the top, even by jumping, unless of course they have the jump spell, and they can jump very high. This is an example of what I have referred to as a hard lock in the game. Remember, these are elements of the game world that developers use to put some limits on where players can explore until they have the right item or story progression. In this place, players cannot go south without the candle and the jump spell. This means players will have to explore and find and complete Parappa Palace before moving to the more difficult areas to the south. Through the cave, we enter the swamps of Madora. To the south of the swamp and across a bridge, we find the town of Sara. Up to this point, the game has done a good job of clearly offering players direction on how to complete the main quest. With our entrance into Sara, our path starts to become less clear. A man at the entrance of town warns that spies of Ganon are everywhere. Some townspeople we talk to will reveal themselves to actually be agents of Ganon, transforming into monsters. This is a great bit of storytelling. In terms of gameplay, however, I don't think it's a great mechanic. It made me not want to talk to the townspeople, but talking to them reveals important hints. It is necessary, but now it carries an element of risk. As with Ruto, there's a woman who gives us a quest to access the next old man and spell. She lost a mirror and it's up to us to find it. To my knowledge, there is no direction on how to find this mirror. There are also no graphic elements to represent it. I used a walkthrough to discover that players need to duck and stab near a table in an empty house just west of the woman's home to find the mirror. When we return it to the woman, she allows us into her home, we speak to her father, who then grants us the life spell. This spell is essential as enemies do not drop health refills in this game. We then head north and west to find Madora Palace in the swamp. The palace is much larger than Parappa. As with Parappa Palace, there are 3 distinct areas, each marked by the presence of an elevator. The first 2 elevators each move between 3 basement-level floors. There is no real theming to the dungeons within Zelda II. Dungeons in the original game weren't really themed either beyond their shapes. But this dungeon feels distinct from Parappa Palace thanks to a dramatically different visual theme. While the first game did change the color of the tiles in each dungeon, here both the color and the overall appearance of the background tiles change. The palace is made out of bright blue bricks arranged vertically. The change in appearance does indeed make a difference in how the dungeon feels. I initially walked away from this dungeon feeling it was completely unique to Parappa Palace, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't the case. Turns out a room that seemed similar to a room in Parappa Palace wasn't just similar, but was an exact duplicate. Madora Palace does introduce new enemies and traps, but as I mentioned, it also contains at least one room that is a duplicate room. In Parappa Palace, it was the room immediately left of the first elevator. Here, it's the room on the middle floor off the first elevator. Players gain keys in each room. Repeated rooms happened in the original game too. That game used different enemy and door placements to make them seem distinct. This game varies enemy placement too, but the repeated rooms end up feeling much more similar all the same. I theorized the first game used repeated rooms as a space-saving technique. The developers were really conscious about saving space, and actually ended up saving too much, resulting in the creation of the game's second quest. I'm not sure why there are repeated rooms here in this game, as this game's second quest is essentially the mode that I'm playing now, where players start out fully leveled up with all the magic spells. I suppose it's possible the developers were still trying to save memory and make a larger game. Despite the repeated room, this dungeon still finds ways to stand on its own. The item found here is the Handy Glove, and it's even used to complete the dungeon. It allows us to break through certain blocks with a sword strike. Some of those breakable blocks fall from the ceiling in the room just before we reach the glove. But we don't need to use the glove to break any blocks until we descend to the lower floor. After breaking through 2 block barriers, we move past a 3rd elevator and continue east to get a key, before returning to the elevator and descending to the lowest floor of the dungeon. The boss of the dungeon is Helmet Head. This is another knight enemy. As with the previous boss, we target its head. This time, in a nod to Gleeok from the original game, Helmet Head loses heads which float around the room and cause some trouble to the player until the boss falls. We pick up the key dropped by the boss and then place the crystal in the statue the next room over before leaving the dungeon. We are rewarded with a level up for placing the crystal. With the palace complete and turned to stone, we return to Sara. The town spans a river, but a guard tells us the bridge is only extended for members of the town. How to move forward is not really clear. In one building of town, there is a slime monster called a bot. It will not attack us. Instead, speaking to it reveals that it is asleep. I have learned from other players that we're supposed to attempt to speak to this monster multiple times, and it finally gives a hint that its master is in the forest to the north. That apparently is supposed to lead us to a house in the forest that's unmarked on the map. The house is surrounded by unmarked battle squares. If we reach the house, we will meet Bagu, who gives us a note that will allow us to cross the river. Once on the other side of the river, we come to Death Mountain. That's right, in the first game we were told that Spectacle Rock is the entrance to Death Mountain, but it turns out there's a back door. This time, the area around Death Mountain is depicted as a brutal maze of caves. While it does not immediately resemble it, this part of the map is in fact a recreation of the world of the original Legend of Zelda, but at a smaller scale. We are supposed to find our way through Death Mountain to reach Spectacle Rock. The caves are full of tough enemies, including the Daira, an axe-wielding alligator monster that hits hard. Link's shield does not block the Daira's axe. We will also run into a red variant which throws axes. This is the point where I've always stopped on previous playthroughs. It's a brutally difficult section. The life spell and the shield spell are essential. I used a walkthrough to reach Spectacle Rock, and had I not been fully leveled up, I likely would have given up here again. Spectacle Rock may not be immediately recognizable to players. There is a cave entrance next to a rock, and they are side by side, like Spectacle Rock in the original game. A close look at the surrounding area and players will be able to make out the original map. The implication here is the cave is the entrance that we made into Death Mountain with bombs in the original game. Inside that cave at Spectacle Rock, we find a hammer. And with the hammer in our possession, we can press the A button on the overworld to destroy rocks. We can destroy rock just outside the cave with a hammer, leading to another magic container to expand our magic level. Thankfully, we don't have to exit Death Mountain the way that we came. There is a path to the north that generally follows the shoreline. This path away from Death Mountain is considerably easier than the path into it. To the east of Death Mountain lies a massive cemetery. Rows of graves marked by crosses stretch on for what must be miles. In the center of the cemetery is one grave that is set apart from the others. There are open pathways around the grave. As we approach, the scene changes, and we can see that the grave is different from all others that we've seen in the game to this point. It sits raised up and has decorative pillars on the ground on either side of it. An old woman stands at the grave, perhaps paying her respects. This, she tells us, is King's tomb. North of the cemetery, we reach a road. To the east is the harbor town of Mido. Before heading there, however, I went west. With the hammer now in my possession, I wanted to put it to use. We can break a roadblock and return to the Madora region. Following a road north, I was able to clear a rock blocking a cave that contained a heart container. I also revisited both Rauru and Ruto towns, but I didn't immediately notice anything different. I then went back through the cave south of Ruto and used the hammer to enter a second blocked cave. In this one, I found a bottled potion. It turns out it's a quest item, though I did not learn that until I returned to Mido. Mido stands apart from the previous towns in that it contains 2 abilities for players to acquire. Thankfully, unlike Soraya, it contains no spies from Ganon, meaning no villagers will turn into monsters when spoken to. An old woman inside Mido told me that I found the life water. I learned from the ZeldaDungeon.net wiki that this woman normally asks players to get the life water to heal a sick child. As I already had it, I was missing that context. After giving her the water, she let me enter her home, where there is an old man with a spell. The spell he teaches is Fairy, which allows Link to turn into a fairy and fly. As a fairy, he can also pass through locked doors. It's a strange spell, but it's useful. In a published conversation with Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii in 1990, Shigeru Miyamoto said that the fairy spell arose from an idea for a Zelda game featuring a party of characters. He referred to this game as Zelda III, and implied that it would be the next game developed. He said that the fairy came from a planned party member who was a girl who looked a little like a fairy, whose role consisted of reconnaissance. Like the characters in action games who don't engage in enemies in combat, but rather go and scout out the surroundings and return safely. Also in town, I was told a bell in the church would ring even though no one was inside. Using the jump spell, I was able to reach a door on the second level of the church. Inside was a swordsman who teaches players the down strike, allowing them to perform a jump attack. Another character gave me a hint to find the next dungeon, telling me I needed to speak to Error in Ruto. Didn't I tell you that the introduction of Error was purposeful? And it turns out there's a story behind his odd name. According to a 2012 official Nintendo Magazine article, 22 Classic Gaming Mistakes by Thomas East, the name Error is no mistake, but part of a joke that was botched in translation. Apparently Bagu, who gave us the note to cross the bridge in Sara, is supposed to be Bug, as in software bug, meaning there were supposed to be characters named Error and Bug as a likely in-joke by the developers. However, for some reason, the Japanese word Bagu went untranslated. It made Error's name stand out even more in the game, and resulted in the joke being lost in players outside of Japan. Returning to the village of Ruto, Error tells us that there's a cave south of King's Tomb. We head back to the massive cemetery. The path around King's Tomb allows players to easily maneuver to travel south. Moving south, it's not long before Link falls into a pit and winds up inside a cave. Players fall right on top of a group of beetle enemies called Louders. Quick-thinking players will be able to use a downward thrust to avoid taking damage. I wasn't quick enough, but I managed to avoid additional damage after running into the first enemy. To the left is an exit back to the cemetery. To the right is a high ledge which is impossible to jump on even with the jump spell. It's another hard lock, preventing players from reaching the Island Palace if they don't have the fairy spell. Using the fairy spell, we can fly to the top of the ledge and continue on to the Island Palace. Once again, the visual appearance of the palace helped this feel distinct from other dungeons in the game. The Island Palace features a red brick look, which I quite like. But as with other dungeons, there's no real theming beyond appearance. The palace is mechanically the same as previous dungeons and features a few repeated rooms. Now this time I didn't notice any room that returned from a previous dungeon, but there are rooms that we first encounter in this dungeon that are used in more than one location. The first repeated room features a number of platforms made of breakable blocks set atop pillars. To me, it gives the impression of the tall mushrooms found in some Super Mario Bros. Levels. We find this room off the elevator at the entrance, and off the elevator that leads to the lowest level of the dungeon. A second set of repeated rooms follows immediately after the first mushroom platform room. They feature breakable floors. The second time we enter this room with the layout, we have to break through the floor to reach a key. This serves as another hard lock in the game. While players can technically reach this dungeon before even taking on Madora Palace, they won't be able to get far. The handy glove is required to complete the dungeon, forcing players to take on Madora Palace first. A standout room in this dungeon is the furthest to the east on the top level. It's an open courtyard. The striking visuals of the outdoor area inside the palace really stand out. This room holds a key, and it's interesting mostly for the change in visual style. Other noteworthy rooms include the room furthest west of the second basement level of the dungeon. It features a large structure made out of breakable blocks. Players have to break through the structure to reach a key, all while avoiding attacks from floating dragon head enemies that spit fireballs. I wasn't too worried about this room until I started getting attacked from both sides as I tried to break my way back out of the structure. I took the most damage from enemies in this room. Traveling east to the opposite side of the palace, we find the dungeon item, the raft. It works just as it did in the original game, allowing players to launch from docks. Or rather from the dock. There's only one in this game, down from 2 in the previous game. The dock here is another hard lock to the eastern part of Hyrule. In the lowest level of the dungeon, we find the boss. It's called Rebenak. It's a blue iron knuckle enemy which rides a hovercraft shaped like a horse. A couple of downward strikes will knock it from the horse, and then it's a standard fight against a blue iron knuckle. Players will have encountered a couple of these enemies earlier in the dungeon. They throw swords while quickly blocking. It's among the most difficult enemies in the game, but I had a much easier time dealing with it thanks to being fully leveled up. Once the boss falls, we will get the final key and place the crystal and exit the dungeon. We can travel back through the cave and return to Mido, where we can use the raft to travel to eastern Hyrule. In this section of Hyrule, there are tougher enemies. A number of them can only be wounded when their eyes are open. Some appear invulnerable. That is until we reach the town of Niburu. There we meet a thirsty woman. Her house is located next to a fountain. Checking the fountain gives us a strange message. Want to get some water? This is apparently telling us that we now have a container of water in our possession, because when we return to the thirsty woman, she lets us into her home. Inside we meet an old man who teaches the fire spell. Enemies who cannot be damaged with regular sword strikes will take damage after the fire spell is cast. There are a few other hints to round up in town. In this town we will meet a man who tells us that if he had boots, he could walk across the water. Sounds like we need to find those boots ourselves. A child tells us to jump in a hole in the palace. And a woman near the outskirts of town tells us to speak to a man in Darunia before we go to the islands. This is a hint that a magic spell will be required to complete the next palace. Heading north from Nibiru, we pass through a cave, and then west to find the town of Darunia. Here we see the return of Ganon's spies, townspeople who turn into monsters when spoken to. In Darunia, we find a woman who urges us to rescue a kidnapped child. The child is found to the east on Maze Island. After crossing a bridge to Maze Island, we take a path south, and then walk all the way east until the path forces us north. We then follow the path to an unmarked square, which leads to a cave with the child inside. Returning the child grants us access to an old man, who teaches the Reflect spell. As I mentioned, this spell is essential for completing the next dungeon. Thanks to a walkthrough, I discovered that Link can quickly duck through a chimney to find a swordsman who teaches Link the upthrust ability. Traveling back east to Maze Island, we again travel south, but then we must take the first fork to the north. We cross a river that runs through the island 2 times, before taking the north fork on the path to cross the river a 3rd time. After the 3rd bridge, there's a fork in the path. I did not know this my first time through the maze, but after the 3rd bridge, players should take the south fork to an unmarked cave with a magic container. These containers are required to get the final spell of the game, and it's best if you can find this container on your first time through the maze. Once the magic container is collected, the goal of the maze is to navigate to the northernmost point of the maze before heading east until being forced south to find the palace. There are a number of unmarked trap squares in the maze, but following the path that I generally describe will result in players passing through the fewest of these trap screens as possible. Now to the dungeon itself. This is the first dungeon I disliked on this playthrough. Again, it has a radically different appearance from the previous dungeons, which makes it feel different. It also features several repeated rooms, both from the previous dungeon and within the dungeon itself. We will have at least 3 rooms from the Island Palace reused in this dungeon. One of those rooms is reused twice. There's also a new room introduced here that's used 3 times within the dungeon. Of note, this dungeon introduces the Wizrobe enemy. They behave much the same as they did in the first game. They appear on the screen, fire a wave of magic, then disappear. Unlike the Wizrobes in the original game, these appear to be weak to only one thing, their own magic. Players wanting to defeat them must cast the Reflect spell to bounce their magic back at them. Players have to be fairly close for this to work, otherwise the Wizrobe will just disappear before their magic spell hits them. I generally found it easiest just to avoid these enemies. When we first enter the dungeon, the west wing is closed behind a locked door. Using an elevator to the east, we descend 1 level, jump over a large pit, and continue all the way east to find a key. We're unable to jump back over the large pit as we backtrack, so as the child in Nibiru suggested, we jump down the pit. After falling 1 level, we head east to find the dungeon item, the boots. Then we double back and fall down the pit for a 2nd time. We head east and have a bit of deja vu as we move through a repeated room to get the key. Then it's back west through another repeated room to get another key, before riding an elevator back up to go to the previously locked west wing. As we move through this wing, we go through 2 rooms we've already seen in this dungeon to get 2 more keys, and 2 rooms that reappear from Island Palace to reach the boss. The boss is called Karok. It's a giant wizard who, despite the difference in name and size, is like a Wizrobe. It disappears and reappears and flings magic with each move. As with the Wizrobes, the strategy is to bounce its spells back at it. For me, that meant casting the Reflect spell, then planting myself on the left side of the screen. Karok fell fairly quickly and is one of the least difficult bosses. After placing the crystal and leveling up, we exit the palace. Prior to this point, we've explored new towns and picked up additional quests before heading to the dungeon. This time, however, is different. We explored 2 towns in the last segment and completed quests in each before moving to the Maze Palace. We also received hints for 2 dungeons in both towns. That means we can head straight to the next dungeon. After completing the palace on Maze Island, we can return to Nibiru. There is a road that leads east from town directly to the sea. This is the path we need to follow to reach the next palace. Luckily, Link has the pair of boots that allow him to walk on the water, or rather, allow him to walk on a very specific path on the sea east of Nibiru, and allow him to cross the river on Maze Island with ease. In the other places I tried, I was never able to walk onto the sea, or was I able to cross another river with the boots. Remember, we did get a hint from a man that said we could walk on the sea if we had the boots. I should also mention another hint I found in Nibiru. One house contains a red ache bat monster. It does not attack the player. Similar to the bot slime monster in Sara, players are required to speak to it multiple times in order to get a hint out of it. It tells us to find heart over ocean. This hint is supposed to let us know that there's a fork in the invisible water path. It's located west of the palace. Players can only find it by testing the north boundary of the invisible path as they walk along it. Once the fork in the path is found, it will take us north, then east, to an invisible side-scrolling area with a heart container. We can then move back to the main path and walk to Ocean Palace. The Ocean Palace is easily the most complex dungeon to this point in the game. It spans 6 floors, contains 6 elevators, and to make matters worse, it features multiple repeated rooms. There's also a false wall that players have to walk through. I have heard much about this wall in various commentaries on The Adventure of Link that suggest that it's one of the unfair design elements of the game. Now, it could just be because I've heard complaints about it before, but I didn't really feel it was unfair. That's partly because a townsperson in Darunia told me the palace has a false wall. With that in mind, I spent time in Maze Palace poking at walls and dead ends searching for the false wall. I never found it, so I kept the hint in mind as I headed into Ocean Palace. A large open room near the center featured a dead end, and I was able to intuit that this was the location of the false wall. Through the wall and down to the lowest level of the palace, I found the dungeon item, the flute. Once again, there's no use for this item inside the dungeon, but it will be essential for finding and reaching the next dungeon. At this point, however, I have to admit I had no idea where to go to reach the boss. I attribute that to the size of the dungeon, its winding passageways and repeated rooms. For example, there is a room with an unbroken ground level path, with 5 roughly evenly spaced platforms made of breakable blocks overhead. This room is generally filled with sorcerer enemies, and it's repeated 4 times in the dungeon. At least 2 of the elevators terminate into identical looking rooms, and the Parappa Palace room where the first key is found appears twice in this dungeon. To its credit, the enemy placement is significantly different from the time that room also appeared in Madora Palace. Those are just a few of the repeated rooms. On top of the repeated rooms, the end boss and the statue room actually appear on the upper level of the dungeon. All previous dungeons had them on the lower levels, with 4 of those dungeons having it on the lowest level. For that reason, this is the first dungeon where I had to turn to a walkthrough to complete it. I also used a walkthrough to complete the dungeons that followed it. The boss is called Goomba. It's a large man wearing a spiked helmet and wielding a mace on chain. I found it difficult to land hits on Goomba. That's likely because I was trying to strike him in the head. That's the weak point of the first 3 bosses of the game. It turns out players actually want to land blows on Goomba's body. Players generally want to move out of range of the attack, and then quickly move in to land a blow of their own, again on the body. It took me longer to figure this out than I would like to admit. I used the Switch's rewind feature multiple times to complete this fight, and ultimately Goomba fell. After the boss is defeated, we can grab the key, place the crystal, and exit the dungeon. A creature sits south of town, blocking Link's path to southeastern Hyrule. It looks like a spider, or perhaps an octopus. We are warned that the river devil eats people, but in actuality it poses no threat to the player. It's only a blockade, a hard lock which prevents further exploration, similar to the rocks that Link crushes with his hammer. But the hammer won't work here, so how do we advance? A woman in Darunia tells us, the devil does not like noise. In some ways this echoes Digdogger from the first game, a creature that dislikes noise, and Link has just acquired a flute. The flute can be played on the overworld screen at any time with a press of the B button. Once the flute sounds, the river devil disappears. To the south we find considerably more difficult enemies. That includes new lizardmen enemies. The Zelda Encyclopedia identifies these as Geru. Players will find a swampland, forest, and cemetery, and across a river, the town of Cudo. When we read the sign at the entrance of town, we're told that it is deserted, and we take damage from an unseen force. I immediately turned around and left. To the west of Cudo is the Valley of Death, which from its name alone we should steer clear of for now. To the east of Cudo there are 3 rocks on the beach. This location is known as Three-Eyed Rocks, as a townsperson will make clear. To the north of the forest there are 2 caves. One contains an experience point bag, the other leads to the east side of the mountains. I later learned that had I gone into the first building in Cudo, I would have found an old man who tells players to look east in the woods. Once I reached the woods on the east side of the mountains, I needed a walkthrough to tell me what to do next. Turns out we need to use the hammer as an axe to clear trees. I am unaware of this ability being mentioned anywhere in the game. I also didn't recall it being mentioned in the manual, but hang on. Let me double check. Well, what do you know? The manual does mention the hammer can be used to clear trees on page 46. This, however, is literally the only place in the game where it's required, and I had forgotten about it. Clearing trees on the northern edge of the forest, on the other side of the mountain, reveals a town that cannot be entered otherwise. This is the hidden town of Cudo. Inside we find the residents of the deserted Cudo, who tell us they were forced to relocate. They also tell us that one person who knows magic stayed behind. We also meet an old woman who invites us into her home immediately. Inside we find not an old man, but a magic container. In another house we find a fireplace. If the fireplace is examined, Link will say he can fit inside. Pressing up will take us to a basement with an old man who teaches us the spell. Yes, it's genuinely just called spell. The manual refers to it as eerie and says that its effects are not fully known, but it will make enemies tremble in fear. I was unable to find any information on how the spell got its name. There's also a woman who tells us there's a secret on the edge of the hidden town. Traveling all the way to the east of town, we find a dead end. I knew to use the spell here thanks to the various commentaries that I've seen over the years. I don't know how quickly I would have figured this out otherwise, but casting the spell causes a building to appear. Inside we find a magic key which allows us to open any door. This key is essential to completing the next dungeon. Inside the hidden town of Cudo, we also find clues for the next dungeon. One woman says a hole in the palace is an endless trap. Another tells us to call for help at the Three-Eyed Rocks. Returning to the rocks on the beach and standing in the center of them, we play the flute to reveal what I'm going to call the Hidden Palace. That is the name used by some guides. Other guides and the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia refer to it as the Three-Eyed Rock Palace. Visually, this dungeon stands out. It's made from a bright purple brick, and those bricks are laid horizontally. This dungeon is notable for not containing any keys. The magical key from the hidden town of Cudo is required to complete it. This dungeon's also not particularly fun. After wandering around inside for a few minutes, I pulled up a walkthrough, and I used it to find my way through. The dungeon item is located on the upper level of the palace. Players must go to the bottom level on the first elevator and head to the right. The path will raise in elevation the further right the player travels. The jump spell is needed to get over a large pit. It's also needed to get over a false floor. I found no mention of this false floor anywhere, and unlike the false wall in the previous dungeon, this seems to be a design that's trolling the players. After getting over the false floor, we run into the first of 2 mini-bosses contained in this dungeon. Both are a repeat boss from the third dungeon, Rebenak. Despite frequently reusing brooms, this is the first time the game has reused a boss. We saw repeated bosses throughout the first game, and we'll see it as a common element throughout the series. This is also the first Zelda II dungeon to feature a mini-boss. Mini-bosses were common in the first game, and will frequently be used in some of the later games as well. Beating Rebenak allows us to get the item of the dungeon, the cross. With this item, Link can see otherwise invisible enemies. Reaching the boss is particularly tricky. While other bosses could be reached in a relatively straightforward manner, that's not the case here. Players must fall down an endless pit. The pit connects 4 floors, then loops players back around to the top. There are platforms suspended on each level of the pit, allowing players to stop on a particular level, or to cross the pit while traversing a particular level. To reach the boss, players have to stop on the 3rd floor, then head east. This fairy spell is needed to fly across a pit of lava. After a second rematch with Rebenak, players must purposely drop down a second pit, which links 3 floors. The pit does not loop, and the second floor features no platforms for the players to use to stop their fall. Instead, players need to quickly turn into a fairy on the second floor and fly down a tunnel to reach the boss. The boss is a dragon called Barba. It's the most unique boss at this point in the game. The boss arena features 4 platforms between pits of lava. Barba rises in and out of the lava pits and breathes fire at the player. The player must strike the dragon on the head to deal damage. I found the jump spell essential to defeating the dragon. Of note, the dragon was apparently called Volvagia in the original Japanese release of the game, or at least that's what's implied by the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia. A passage on the Hidden Palace, which again it calls the Three-Eyed Rock Palace, reads, "In some places Barba is called Volvagia." And an entry on Volvagia in the enemy database states, "Volvagia is known as Barba in the Adventure of Link." A dragon boss called Volvagia will later appear in Ocarina of Time, further strengthening the link between Zelda II and Ocarina of Time. Once we've completed 6 palaces and learned 7 spells and collected 4 magic containers, it's time to head to the Great Palace to claim the Triforce. But first, there's one more magic spell we need. With the cross from Hidden Palace, invisible enemies are now visible, allowing players to explore the deserted Cudo more safely, though no real exploration is needed. The first house contains an old man who grants players the Thunder spell, provided that players have first gathered all 4 hidden magic containers. Thunder is required to complete the game, so finding the magic containers is also required. I tried further exploring the town, but there's nothing of interest. All the buildings were empty and I found no secrets there. I would recommend simply turning around and exiting once the Thunder spell is acquired. With the spell in hand, it's on to the Valley of Death. I found this to be a brutal gauntlet of enemies. There are a couple of unmarked squares which contain hidden enemy encounters. Players must also deal with the standard semi-random enemy encounters. While it's possible to avoid these encounters on other parts of the map, there is no room here to maneuver and no way to avoid them. Players also have to pass through 2 caves. Ghost enemies called Moa are plentiful here, as are the Geru. It took me multiple tries and, eventually, plentiful use of the rewind feature to make it through the valley. On the other side of the valley we reached the Great Palace. The developers add the first permanent checkpoint to the game right here. As mentioned in the previous episode, director Tadashi Sugiyama admitted to upping the difficulty level to pad out the game time. That's part of the reason that players are sent back to North Castle after getting a game over. It seems the developers realized that sending the player back to North Castle after passing through the Valley of Death was a bridge too far, though. The Great Palace is the largest, most complex dungeon in the game. It's filled with tough, new enemies, including fire-spewing bird enemies called Fotel, and a bird-like, more powerful iron knuckle replacement called a Foca. There are also larger and tougher versions of past enemies, like the King Bubble, and even a giant bot. Notably, it does not contain keys or locked doors. The challenge comes strictly from navigation and combat. A force field prevents players from entering unless they've placed all 6 crystals in the previous dungeons. If the crystals were placed, the force field opens and players can walk inside. I used a walkthrough almost immediately from the start. In what I believe was the second room that I came to, a false floor dropped me into a fight with some tougher dark blue bot enemies. This isn't the first false floor in the game, and with no indication of where they are, I decided I didn't want to deal with the trolling game design and pulled up the walkthrough. A few notable things about the Great Palace. First, like Death Mountain in the first game, the Great Palace is set apart with a new musical theme. Tonally, however, this new theme is much closer to the standard palace theme. There are no locked doors, save one in the Great Palace or keys to find. This renders the magic key found in the hidden town of Cudo useless after being used for only one dungeon. I also found it interesting that the Great Palace seemed to space out its combat encounters more. There were stretches where I walked through 2 rooms without seeing an enemy. That said, the increased difficulty meant that I still lost 1 life, and I used the rewind frequently to make it to the end. The walkthrough led me to 2 secret rooms hidden behind false walls to gain magic refills. I don't mind these hidden rooms with their false walls as much as I mind the false floors. After all, these seem to be secrets for the players to find and are not required. Floors, however, pop up with no indication to troll the player. There's also one room I was guided to where players have to purposely break through blocks on the floor to find a false floor to progress. I'm not sure I would have found this on my own. The breakable blocks on the floor could be viewed as an indication of what players need to do, but it's not the most clear, and there is a large row of blocks but only a small area of false floor. The Great Palace ends in a pair of boss fights. The first is Thunderbird, a flying enemy that flings fireballs at the player. When it first appears, it is red and it has no face. Using the Thunder spell turns Thunderbird blue and reveals its face, which is its weak point. I used the jump spell to help me get some extra height to attack Thunderbird, but this fight generally boils down to avoiding fireballs until Thunderbird dips low enough to hit it. I often use the rewind to help me make it through this fight. Once Thunderbird falls, it rewards the players with a key. Players then continue east to find the final room of the dungeon. It holds an old man with the Triforce of Courage inside, but players must first defeat the final boss of the game before they can claim it. It's a shadowy version of Link, often called Dark Link. It's worth noting that Dark Link has his own musical theme. I haven't discussed this prior to this point, but Zelda II is actually the first game in the series to feature a distinct boss theme. Here's the basic boss theme. It's a short loop with notes ascending in large steps before quickly descending. It's simple, but I think it does instill a sense of unease when fighting in a boss encounter. The Dark Link fight music starts the same as the standard boss music, but quickly deviates. Take a listen. The loop for the Dark Link theme is longer than the standard boss theme loop. Most players defeat this boss by cheesing it, ducking in the left corner and repeatedly stabbing. The boss won't be able to land a blow and will fall quickly. That's how I defeated the boss. With that, players are awarded the Triforce. Link returns to North Castle, Zelda awakens, thanks Link, and as a curtain descends to hide Link and Zelda from sight, she gives him a kiss. Then the credits roll. We've completed 7 palaces, obtained the Triforce of Courage, and awoken the sleeping Princess Zelda. Let's take a look at the world of the game now. Zelda II expands the lore and the setting of the series quite a bit. The world itself, as with the entire game, is separated into the overworld viewed from an overhead perspective, and a series of action scenes and towns viewed from a side-scrolling perspective. The overworld presents a Hyrule of much larger scale than seen in the previous game. It's viewed from a much more zoomed-out perspective. It's not immediately clear from looking at the map, but the whole thing is built on a grid of squares. Movement happens between these squares. Towns, palaces, and certain action screens like caves are presented as icons on the map, which are then entered by touching them. Enemies and fairies are also represented by icons on the map. Small slime monster icons similar to the bot enemies represent weak enemy encounters, and large humanoid monsters represent strong encounters. Fairies appear as fairies. In Zelda II, Hyrule is separated between 4 major areas on 2 continents. The first of the 4 areas is the starting area on the first continent. It includes North Castle, Madora Desert, and the towns of Rauru and Ruto. The second area is through the caves south of Ruto. The jump spell and the candle are required to reach it. The second area includes Madora Swamp, Sara Town, the harbor town of Mido, Death Mountain, and the Island Palace. The third area is on the second continent and is reachable only by raft. It includes the towns of Naburu, Darunia, Maze Island, and the Ocean Palace. The fourth area is blocked by the River Devil, which is defeated only with the flute. This area includes the destroyed town of Cudo, the rebuilt Hidden Town, the Hidden Palace, the Valley of Death, and the Great Palace. Each of these 4 areas is hard-locked, meaning players cannot venture into them until they acquire the proper item or spell. The tighter structure of the world also means that the dungeons have a set order which can't really be varied from. items in each dungeon are required to reach the next dungeon in sequence. Madora Palace in particular is especially crucial. It can't be completed without the handy glove, and later dungeons also require it. Yes, truly determined players can venture into a dungeon, acquire the item, and then leave in an effort to vary the dungeon order, but that isn't a practical way to play. Players will ultimately have to return and defeat the boss in order to unlock the Great Palace. This more structured approach to exploration means that the world is continually expanding for most of the playtime. There is still room to explore, and secrets to find in each area, but the world is open to the player in smaller chunks at a time. The game also generally does a good job with its hints to help guide the player along the quest, though the game was occasionally too obscure in its design. The required meeting with Bagu to get the note to cross the river in Soraya is the first instance of this obscure design. The supposed hint to his location is difficult to find and entirely unclear. Also unclear is how players are intended to find the hidden town of Cudo. Players need to use the hammer as an axe. As I said, this ability is mentioned in the manual, but there's no hint to it in the game, and it's literally the only place where it's required. Players don't need to clear trees to meet Bagu in the woods, but they do need to clear trees to access the hidden Cudo. Of Zelda II's 8 towns, each is represented from a side-scrolling perspective, and they are split between multiple screens which scroll with the player. There's an effort from the developers to make each town feel unique in some way, with different color schemes, quests, and layouts. Soraya, for instance, has its river bridge, while Mido has the church, and Nibiru has water fountains. I'll say that while I was not a big fan of the mechanic in some towns of containing spies of Ganon, which brings danger to the game's few safe zones, the bit of storytelling it achieves is good. The towns go a long way towards making the Hyrule of Zelda II feel like an actual place. Back out to the world map, the zoomed out view and the inclusion of 2 continents does contribute to Zelda II's world feeling much bigger than the one contained in the original Legend of Zelda. The game further emphasizes this by including a representation of the original game's map on the southern end of Death Mountain. We can see Spectacle Rock represented as a rock in a cave side by side. A cemetery lies to the southeast of it. There are 2 forests. 2 lakes are also represented. It's a fun Easter egg for returning players of the first game, while building out Hyrule. I said the first game lacks a sense of place. It just didn't feel like a kingdom where people lived and worked. Here, Zelda II changes the context, making the world of the original game a small region in a much larger kingdom. Overall, I like the world of Zelda II, but I don't necessarily like exploring it. That's because of the semi-random nature of the battles with monsters and the difficulty of this game. Playing the special edition included in Nintendo Switch NES Online allowed me to largely ignore these battles, or exit them as quickly as possible, but the constant interruptions to the flow of exploration are annoying. Today, there are a few players who would say that Zelda II is their favorite entry in the series. There are a significant number of people who don't like it at all. Prior to this playthrough, I was one of them. However, playing through the special edition, I found a lot to like. There's still plenty I don't like. As mentioned, the game's design is sometimes too obscure, and even with the difficulty reduced, I still found some areas frustratingly difficult. I had fun with the first 3 dungeons, but I felt much more mixed about the final 4. On the whole, Zelda II remains my least favorite entry in the Zelda games. But through making this podcast, I've gained a new appreciation for it. I think Zelda fans should not skip this game, and I think it should not be left out of conversations on the development or evolution of the series. As discussed in the previous episode, Zelda II is a key part of the story. Next week, I'm resuming my normal schedule for this podcast. We'll jump into Season 8, which kicks off with a revisit of A Link to the Past. Then we'll take a look at the first multiplayer entry for the series, 4 Swords. If you want to follow along and you haven't already, please consider subscribing. And I owe a big thanks to everyone who has already subscribed. I'm glad that you're liking what I'm doing enough to follow along. I am Paul Riley, and I will see you next week.